Let me put a question on the table that rarely gets asked clearly. Who is actually shaping American foreign policy decisions in moments like this? Not as a slogan, not as a partisan argument, but as a real structural question. Because when you look at how major military decisions unfold, the process is not always as visible as people assume. In theory, the system is straightforward. The president is the commander-in-chief. Congress holds the power to authorize war. Intelligence agencies provide assessments. Military planners present options. But in practice, decisions often move faster than that framework suggests. Presidents can authorize limited military actions without a formal declaration of war. Intelligence assessments are often classified. Congressional consultation can be brief, delayed, or politically constrained, and that creates a gap. A gap between what the public expects, open debate, clear justification, defined objectives, and what actually happens in real time during a crisis. That gap matters. Because when military action begins without a fully articulated public case, it raises difficult questions about accountability, transparency, and long-term strategy. Now consider the role of intelligence. Strategic decisions are only as strong as the assumptions behind them. If those assumptions about timelines, outcomes, or internal dynamics of another country turn out to be wrong, the entire operation can drift away from its original expectations. History is full of examples where initial projections underestimated resilience, overestimated internal opposition, or misread the speed of political change. And once that happens, momentum takes over, military commitments expand, economic consequences compound, political flexibility narrows. At the same time, external partners and allies influence the broader strategic picture. Intelligence sharing, regional priorities, and aligned interests all shape how threats are perceived and how responses are designed. That influence is real, but it's part of a complex network, not a single point of control, which brings us to the idea of a global blockade. It's a powerful phrase, but operationally it's far more complicated than it sounds. To truly enforce a global maritime restriction on a country's exports, you would need sustained naval presence across multiple regions: the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, key transit routes in the Indian Ocean and beyond. You would need legal authority to stop and inspect vessels on the high seas, and you would need broad international cooperation because without it, enforcement becomes inconsistent and contested. In reality, what often emerges is something less absolute: pressure in key choke points, interdictions in specific cases, increased risk that alters commercial behavior, and that risk alone can disrupt flows. Shipping slows, insurance costs rise, alternative routes are explored, trade patterns shift, so the impact becomes global, even if the enforcement is not. At the same time, there's a broader strategic layer developing in the background. Countries across Eurasia are gradually expanding economic and financial cooperation outside traditional Western systems. New payment mechanisms, bilateral trade agreements, and regional partnerships are reducing reliance on a single global framework. This isn't happening overnight, but it is measurable, and moments of crisis tend to accelerate it, because countries watch how major powers act under pressure and they adjust accordingly. Some hedge, some diversify. Some move closer to alternative systems. That's how long-term realignments begin, not through a single dramatic event, but through accumulated decisions. Meanwhile, the economic effects are already visible. Energy prices rise quickly when supply routes are disrupted or even perceived to be at risk. And energy costs don't stay isolated. They feed into transportation, agriculture, manufacturing, and ultimately consumer prices. Fuel costs affect everything from food production to logistics. When those costs spike rapidly, the impact moves through the economy just as quickly, and the longer the disruption lasts, the more structural those effects become, which leads to another critical question: what is the objective? Short-term military pressure can achieve tactical results, but if the underlying strategy doesn't account for resilience, adaptation, and long-term consequences, those gains can be temporary. That's why proposals for quick, decisive strikes often face skepticism, because the key variable isn't just capability, it's whether the assumptions behind the plan match reality. If they don't, the outcome rarely aligns with expectations, and once a conflict reaches that stage, options narrow, costs rise, and the path forward becomes harder to define. Shortening the timeline doesn't solve the problem, it compresses it. If the core assumption behind a strategy is wrong, increasing the tempo doesn't fix it, it magnifies the fallout. And there's another risk here that isn't being addressed openly. Up to this point, Iran's response has been deliberate, not absent, but calibrated. Some capabilities have been used. Others, far more disruptive, have remained in reserve. Key infrastructure across the Gulf is still largely functioning. Major shipping routes are under pressure, but not fully shut. Critical communication links beneath the sea have not been widely targeted. That's not a limitation. That's restraint. Holding capabilities back preserves options. It sustains leverage. It keeps escalation within a band that can still be controlled. But a faster, more concentrated strike alters that equation. It sends a message that restraint doesn't reduce pressure, it invites more of it. And once that perception takes hold, the logic changes. What was previously a measured response can expand, not out of preference, but out of necessity, because the value of holding back begins to disappear. That's where the real risk emerges. The next phase wouldn't be gradual, it would be systemic. Energy systems across the region become exposed. Maritime corridors face deeper disruption. The digital infrastructure that connects global markets becomes a potential target. At that point, the consequences don't stay local, they go global. And recovery from that kind of shock doesn't happen quickly. Energy capacity takes years to rebuild. Supply chains take time to reconfigure. Markets don't stabilize evenly. The impact lingers, which is why the idea of a rapid, high-intensity strike doesn't resolve the underlying issue. It risks expanding it into something far more difficult to contain. Now shift to the diplomatic layer. Two recent interactions stand out, not because of their public messaging, but because of their sequence. First, a high-level engagement between Iranian and Russian leadership. Not symbolic but extended, suggesting detailed discussion of strategy, limits, and red lines. Then, shortly after, direct contact between Russian and American leadership. That order matters because it points to transmission. One side clarifies its position internally, defines its boundaries, and then that understanding is carried into a conversation with another major actor. It doesn't imply coordination, but it does imply awareness. And in moments like this, awareness is critical. It shapes expectations. It influences risk tolerance. It defines how signals are interpreted. That's the layer most people don't see, not the visible movements, but the quiet exchange of understanding behind them. And more often than not, that's where the trajectory of a crisis is truly determined. Different command structures, different rules of engagement, and different escalation thresholds create space for miscalculation. In a region as narrow and high traffic as the Strait of Hormuz, even a small misunderstanding can escalate fast. The second challenge is U.S. deterrence posture. The United States still maintains overwhelming naval dominance in the region through the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, and officials are now saying contingency plans include rapid escort operations for commercial shipping if risk levels cross defined thresholds. That creates a constant pressure environment where every move is being watched, mirrored, and countered in real time. The third challenge is political sustainability. Governments change positions, domestic pressure builds, economic stress inside all involved countries can shift priorities quickly. Even within Iran, different security and political factions don't always move in perfect alignment, and in Russia's case, long-term commitments far from its core theaters always come with resource trade-offs. Can they actually deliver a stable, coordinated, long-term presence in this environment? That's the real question, because building influence is one thing. Maintaining it under pressure from global markets, military deterrence, and internal political constraints is something else entirely. Sources are now confirming they're trying, but whether that effort holds under sustained pressure is still uncertain. What happens next moves beyond statements and into measurable actions on the ground and at sea. The next key checkpoint is May 10, 2026, when regional defense officials are expected to review updated maritime risk assessments in the Gulf. According to reports, this will include joint input from U.S. naval command structures and Gulf state intelligence agencies. What happens in that meeting will set the tone for the next operational posture in the Strait of Hormuz. Here's what to watch. The May 10th briefing outcome. Does the United States formally expand escort operations for commercial tankers? Russian naval positioning after May 10th? Do vessels remain in place, expand their presence, or reposition closer to key choke points? Iranian signaling patterns. Do we see increased activity from IRGC naval units or a shift toward quieter deterrence messaging? Because here's the reality. If Russia maintains a visible operational footprint and Iran continues escalation signaling while the United States increases escort and surveillance operations, then we are looking at a sustained multi-actor pressure environment, not a short-term crisis spike. But if Russia begins scaling back its presence after early May and diplomatic channels open quietly in the background, this could de-escalate faster than expected, so it becomes a question of momentum. If escalation signals continue through mid-May, this accelerates into a prolonged strategic standoff. If they taper off, markets stabilize and attention shifts elsewhere. The next few weeks will tell us everything. What unfolded around the Strait of Hormuz on May 3, 2026, was not just another escalation headline. It was a structural shift in how influence is being projected across one of the most important energy corridors in the world. What we are really seeing is a transition from a relatively predictable balance where the United States dominated maritime security, Iran applied pressure through asymmetric threats, and Russia stayed mostly on the sidelines to a far more layered and unstable configuration. Now, multiple nuclear-capable powers are operating within the same narrow choke point, each with overlapping interests and none fully trusting the other. That's historically significant. Moments like this don't just create short-term volatility in oil markets or temporary diplomatic crises. They often mark the beginning of longer strategic realignments, where rules that once felt stable start to erode under pressure from competing powers. Whether this becomes a lasting shift or just another high-tension cycle depends entirely on what happens in the coming weeks, especially around military posture and energy security responses. What stands out most is not just the movement itself, but the speed of it. The fact that multiple actors adjusted positions, rhetoric, and readiness levels within a 24 to 48-hour window suggests a level of sensitivity in the system that leaves very little room for error. That's what makes this situation so closely watched right now. Where does this go from here? Are we looking at controlled containment of tension, or the early stages of a wider regional power struggle? Now let's talk about something that almost never gets discussed seriously in public, the structural decisions inside the U.S. military system that made this situation more likely and are now being exposed by it. Because this isn't just about policy choices in the moment, it's about decades of assumptions that no longer hold. The United States spends, depending on how you calculate it, roughly $1.70 trillion a year on defense and defense-related activities. That is an enormous figure, larger than the combined military spending of multiple major powers. But the issue is not the size of the budget, it's how that money is being used. What recent conflicts have revealed, whether in the Middle East or Eastern Europe, is that the traditional model of forward military presence is becoming increasingly vulnerable. Large bases, carrier strike groups, and fixed infrastructure were designed for a different era, one where detection was limited and precision strike capabilities were far less advanced. That world no longer exists. Today, surveillance is persistent, targeting is precise, strike systems can reach further, faster, and with greater accuracy than ever before, and that changes the equation completely. When you place large, expensive military assets within range of these systems, they don't just project power, they also become high-value targets. Defending them at scale becomes extraordinarily costly. Interceptor systems are used faster than they can be replenished. Defensive layers get saturated, and the very presence that was supposed to expand strategic flexibility starts to constrain it. Because now every decision carries the risk of losing assets that are both expensive and symbolically important. This is what some analysts refer to as the forward presence trap. The doctrine itself was built in a time when these vulnerabilities didn't exist at this level. Aircraft carriers, for example, were once revolutionary tools of power projection, but in an environment shaped by advanced missile systems, space-based tracking, and coordinated swarm capabilities, their survivability is increasingly questioned. The same logic applies to air bases and other fixed installations. Facilities that took decades and billions of dollars to build can, under certain conditions, be neutralized far more quickly than they can be replaced. And yet, despite these changes, procurement systems continue to produce platforms designed around older threat models. Why? Because institutions have inertia, supply chains are already built, contracts are already in place, political incentives are tied to maintaining production lines, and changing that direction requires disrupting systems that have been in motion for decades. So the result is a mismatch. A massive budget continues to flow, but not necessarily toward the capabilities most aligned with the current threat environment. What would a shift look like? It would mean investing more heavily in defensive resilience, distributed systems, unmanned platforms, and long-range deterrence that does not rely on vulnerable forward positioning. It would mean accepting that some legacy concepts no longer provide the advantage they once did. But that shift is slow, and in moments like this, the consequences of that delay become visible. Now, with that context, let's look at the actual choices in front of U.S. leadership. Because despite all the complexity, the decision space can be simplified into three broad paths. The first option is disengagement, to step back, halt military operations, and open the door for negotiated solutions involving multiple international actors, whether that includes major powers or regional stakeholders. This path carries political cost. It requires acknowledging that the current approach did not achieve its intended outcomes. It requires resisting pressure from actors who benefit from continued escalation, but strategically it limits further damage, economic, military, and reputational. The second option is continuation without escalation, maintaining pressure through indirect means, economic constraints, regional positioning, while avoiding a major new military move. The challenge here is sustainability. History shows that prolonged pressure campaigns rarely produce decisive outcomes quickly. Meanwhile, the economic and systemic costs accumulate not just for the target, but for the initiator as well. Over time, this path tends to drift toward one of two endpoints: escalation or negotiation. The third option is escalation, a renewed, more intense use of force aimed at achieving objectives that were not reached in earlier phases. This is the highest risk path, because it assumes that a larger application of the same tools will produce a different outcome while also increasing the probability of broader regional consequences. And in highly interconnected systems, escalation rarely stays contained. Now, what distinguishes effective strategic leadership is not the ability to act, but the ability to choose which actions not to take, because every option here has costs. The question is which cost structure is sustainable and which one creates long-term instability. There are historical examples of negotiated frameworks managing strategic choke points and regional tensions without requiring permanent military escalation. There are also examples of powers adjusting their posture when conditions change, rather than doubling down on outdated assumptions. Those precedents matter, not as direct comparisons, but as reminders that alternatives exist. At the same time, decision-making in reality is never purely strategic. It is influenced by alliances, domestic politics, institutional pressures, and prior commitments. Those factors shape what is possible, not just what is optimal. And that is why moments like this are so difficult, because the path that minimizes long-term damage is not always the path with the lowest short-term political cost. So the real question is not whether a better option exists, it's whether the system is capable of choosing it, because timing matters. The longer a conflict continues, the narrower the range of low-cost outcomes becomes. Options that were once available begin to disappear. What remains are higher-risk, higher-cost decisions, and that is where things stand, not at a clear resolution, but at a narrowing set of choices, which makes the next decision more important than any that came before it.